Funding for Our Town Gallipolis is provided by Ohio Valley Bank and its Community First mission. Established in 1872, Ohio Valley Bank has 16 locations throughout Ohio and West Virginia. More information at ovbc.com. And from Holzer Health System, providing care throughout southeastern Ohio and western West Virginia. In the words of Dr. Charles E. Holzer, Jr., the patient is the center of all we do. Additional support provided by the Gallia County Chamber of Commerce, working for business, supporting the community, and investing in Gallia County. The University of Rio Grande and Rio Grande Community College, providing an oasis of learning, innovation, and technology in the region. Rio Grande, personal, powerful, proud. Willis Funeral Home, family-owned and operated since 1974. At Willis, our aim is to be worthy of your friendship. The Gallia County Convention and Visitors Bureau, providing a source for regional and community events and information about beautiful, historic Gallipolis and Gallia County. The Wiseman Insurance Agency of Gallipolis, a fourth-generation family business serving Ohio and the surrounding area since 1928. And by the Farmers Bank and Saving Company, member FDIC.
As the bourgeois militia stormed the Bastille, igniting revolution in France, a 19-year-old boy picked up a musket and joined the fray. Guillaume Dudouis came from the upper crust of French society, and he was just beginning a career as a silversmith. France was on the precipice of revolution. Countless would die in battle. Thousands more would meet their fate at the guillotine. While war raged, William Dewar, an American real estate speculator, formed an organization known as the Scioto Company. His goal was to sell land to French refugees in the newly formed Northwest Territory. Dewar sent American Joel Barlow and Scotsman William Playfair to Paris to serve as his agents. The pair traveled throughout France, selling deeds to property in the Northwest Territory, promising a land of unlimited opportunity and a village awaiting named Gallipolis, the city of the Gauls. Artisans, craftsmen, and silversmiths listened in awe as Playfair described the Eden awaiting on the other side of the Atlantic, a far cry from the chaos surrounding them.
Life was to be one long, sweet Arcadian dream on this marvelously bountiful land, where sickness, except from overeating, was unknown, and death came only as the result of fabulously old age. William Sibley.
Surrounded by the horrors of war, Guillermo Dudouis and his young wife Agnes Marie chose to leave for Playfair's oasis. Approximately 500 of their countrymen joined them. They gathered at Le Havre, France in early 1790 and boarded ships for America.
What is there to stay in France? The revolution is starting to boil over. The American Revolution and the French Revolution differed. The French Revolution was far more bloodthirsty than the American Revolution ever was. What do they have left to lose at this point?
After 3 months at sea, they landed at Alexandria, Virginia. Upon arrival, they searched for officers of the Scioto Company to take them to their new home. None were found. A realization of deceit washed over the party.
Playfair absconded with the money before he was able to send it back to purchase the land legitimately, so the French 500 sailed not knowing they were holding worthless deeds in their hands.
No one knew about this except the two scallywags who had sold them all the worthless deeds and taken their money.
The Scioto Company was a sham. The deeds Playfair sold were for land owned by the Ohio Company, a group of legitimate land speculators.
Then there gushed forth such an outpouring of the French tongue and such a wild storm of French gesticulation that never was heard or seen on American soil before or since. It was well for Playfair that an ocean rolled between him and his excited victims. William Sibley.
Returning to France was not an option, and with no deed to property, they were stranded. The party sent messengers to President George Washington, pleading for help. After some negotiation, the Ohio Company agreed to let the French settle on their land, and a location was chosen on the banks of the Ohio River. In June of 1790, the Ohio Company sent 40 men from Marietta to build 80 log cabins for the refugees.
They came by boat and came into the park where the center of the park would be, and there was where the first tree was cut down by Colonel Robert Safford.
After waiting in Alexandria for months, when news came that their village was ready, the French finally departed for Gallipolis.
They went across land by wagon from Alexandria to Pittsburgh, and then got on flatboats and came down the Ohio River, 200 miles down the river. They landed here on October the 17th, 1790.
The first night they were here, they pulled their powdered wigs and their best clothes out, and they had a ball.
And they had music, and they danced, and they celebrated that they were in their new country to start their new lives.
The Puritans, who came from Marietta to show the way, and who had just built the lodgings, were scandalized by the frivolity of the Frenchmen and laughed at the childish buoyancy. But it was some accomplishment to make the Puritan laugh. His heart opened and his fanaticism died of exposure. Lawrence J. Kenny.
As the sun rose on their second day in Gallipolis, they found themselves alone, surrounded by a vast and untamed wilderness.
They were told in France that this was the land of milk and honey, and it was far from that.
This was mostly the people who were artisans, doctors, lawyers, merchants, who knew nothing about farming, raising crops. So they had to try to figure out what were they going to eat when they got here.
Nowhere in all the annals of American colonies is there a sharper contrast of light and shade, in fact or in symbol, than here, where old nobles and counts with their gentle ladies right out of the most brilliant court the world has ever known are translated, as if by some bad magic, to the uncouth haunts of savage men and beasts. Lawrence J. Kenny.
There was a swamp. They sustained themselves on frog legs. But then again, the swamp they ate out of also killed some of them with diseases and things. But I guess if you was worried about your head being cut off in France, this would be good.
Winters were especially devastating. Guillaume and Agnes Dudouis lost an infant son and daughter. They were laid to rest in City Park, the town's first cemetery. Slowly, the French learned to survive on their own. Hunting parties were organized to supply meat for the town. Francois de Havicourt, a classmate of Napoleon Bonaparte, organized the Gallipolis militia to defend against hostile Native Americans, and Antoine Saugrène, an accomplished doctor and scientist, provided medical care for the village. Standing just 4 feet 6 inches tall, he was known as Le Petit Docteur. And in November of 1790, the town saw its first wedding when Claudius Roman Leménager married the beautiful Marie Bobin.
She was born at Versailles in 1772, allegedly the illegitimate daughter of Louis XVI. When she caught the eye of the ambitious officer named Napoleon Bonaparte.
And he tried to woo her back. He would send messengers to give her gifts, and one of them was a medallion. And she told him that she was in love with her husband, and she loved her children, and she loved it here, and she would remain here.
While the Ohio Company had let the French live on their land, they still expected to be compensated. A few years after arriving, the settlers were required to pay the company for the property, essentially buying it twice. For many, this was too much, and they left the town forever. In 1795, Congress allocated a section of land in Scioto County for those who had been defrauded, known as the French Grant. Guillaume and Agnes Dudouis took the offer, and with a deed signed by Thomas Jefferson, left Gallipolis. Agnes died soon after. Guillaume remarried and lived the rest of his life on the grant, fathering 20 children. While the French population declined, new ethnic groups took their place: Welsh, Germans, and settlers from New England. The river was the lifeblood of Gallipolis, allowing farm crops to flow out and money to flow in.
At that time, early time, there was no railroad, there was no nothing. So the river was the only means of going anywhere, unless you got on a horse or something like that.
The river also brought many travelers to Gallipolis. Recognizing the need to provide lodging and accommodation, Elizabeth Cushing and her brother Henry built the Our House Tavern.
Henry would go to the river and he'd say, "Y'all come on over to our house and you'll get drink and eat. You could eat here, you could stay all night here." And it was the finest quality.
Over the years, the Our House was occupied by many notable guests. In May of 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette visited Gallipolis on his tour of America and dined with his fellow Frenchmen.
They decided to throw a party here in the ballroom for General Lafayette. They were dressed to their finest. General Lafayette spilt something on his jacket. He left it here for us, and we still have that jacket here today.
In addition to Lafayette, the Our House also entertained other prestigious guests.
William Allen was a young, upcoming lawyer, and he was riding his horse one day. So he opened up the door and came right on in with his horse. Henry knew that William Allen was just a little bit tipsy, so he told him that he would gladly serve him a glass of buttermilk, and which William Allen took, and he drank it, and then he decided it was time for him to leave, so he backed his horse out and went on down the street. William Allen later became governor of Ohio.
It is unclear if, when the horse walked into the bar, Henry asked, "Why the long face?" Early Gallipolis was a tough town. While major crime was rare, an occasional murder rocked the city. In 1816, Jim Lane murdered William Dow over $5. He was arrested and sentenced to the only public execution in Gallipolis. A large crowd gathered to witness his hanging.
The Presbyterian minister that was supposed to be giving his last rites, I guess, decided he had an audience, and he preached for 2 hours while that man stood there. Well, you know, if it was a Baptist preacher, he'd have been there longer.
Overseeing Lane's trial as judge was Colonel Robert Safford, who had felled the first tree in City Park nearly 30 years prior. He was elected to the Ohio General Assembly in 1810 and the Ohio Senate from 1828 to 1831. While Safford was in the legislature, the bonds of slavery gripped the American South. and Gallia County became a major thoroughfare for those traveling the Underground Railroad. Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church served as a safe house for the freedom seekers who then departed for destinations north. As Civil War spread throughout the states, the city park was transformed into a supply depot, and Mound Hill was fortified with cannons. When President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans across the country rejoiced. News reached Gallipolis within days, and the town's black residents immediately organized a celebration.
They celebrated, and it's been a continuous celebration with no interruption since that day.
They had horse races, they had ball games, they had greasy pole climbs, try to catch greasy pig. I mean, just all kind of different activities. But we continuously, for 156 years now, have celebrated Emancipation Proclamation.
So don't get us confused with Juneteenth in Texas.
In August 1863, John Charrington enlisted with the 7th Ohio Cavalry. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Charrington was selected for a daring mission. He and a group of 25 soldiers, including fellow Gallia Countians Lee Wood and Andrew Holman, were chosen to pursue Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The men donned Confederate uniforms and mingled with rebel soldiers, gathering information about Davis's whereabouts. The intelligence they uncovered was pivotal in the capture of the fleeing president. When the Civil War ended, a group of citizens erected a bandstand in City Park as a memorial to the city's fallen soldiers. As Gallia County progressed through the late 1800s, new settlements sprung up across the hills. Towns like Cheshire, Bidwell, and Patriot. And 10 miles north of Gallipolis came the village of Rio Grande.
And at the time of the Mexican War, a newspaper came, the story goes, and it had a battle being fought on the Rio Grande River. Well, Spanish was not real predominantly spoken in southeastern Ohio in the 1840s, and so it was pronounced the way we Appalachians and good Gallia Countians pronounce things. We called it Rio Grande because that's what it looked like.
Among the residents of the tiny hamlet was a young Baptist minister named Ira Z. Haining. In Rio Grande, he met wealthy landowners Permelia and Nehemiah Atwood and soon converted them to Baptists.
The one thing that holds all Baptists of all stripes together is the fact that they don't believe in infant baptism or sprinkling. You got to go the full immersion route.
They were so intent that they were baptized in January in Raccoon Creek, and I think that might be a good sign of devotion.
After their frigid submersion, Reverend Haining convinced the Atwoods to help educate the local youth. In 1875, construction of Atwood Hall at Rio Grande College began.
It was said that you could see the building from 4 miles away and hear the bells 6 miles away. At the time, people were said to set their clocks at home by the rings of the bell tower. There were 2 reasons Rio Grande sits where it's at. One is because Permelia already owned the land, and 2, she wanted it away from the influences of the city. One of the towns under consideration was Cheshire, but Cheshire was discounted because it was too worldly.
The first class of students from Rio Grande College graduated in 1883, and the institution became the center of higher learning in Gallia County. However, quality education was not limited to Rio Grande, and in 1868, Lincoln Colored School was established to serve the city's African American youth. In 1908, a new principal with an impressive resume arrived. 30 years earlier, Edward Boucher became one of the first black graduates of Yale University. He then received his doctorate in physics from Yale and became the first African American in history to earn a PhD. He was also one of the first 20 Americans of any race to earn a doctorate.
He was sixth in his class. He was very smart. You would have thought that he would have taught at the university level, but he never, ever was once given a university position.
When he arrived at the Lincoln School, he immediately raised its academic standards.
And he raised those standards from one teacher in 4 subjects, but when he left, they had 3 languages being taught, and of course physics, all the math, English, histories.
After a lengthy court battle, Lincoln School and the all-white Gallia Academy integrated in 1918. However, the court's ruling did not apply to elementary schools, and the youngest African American students in Gallipolis remained segregated until the 1950s. The citizens of early Gallipolis found entertainment in many different ways. In 1910, the town shared a minor league baseball team with Point Pleasant. The Pointers finished 3rd in the Virginia Valley League. Due to decreased attendance, the team moved upriver to Pomeroy and Middleport the following year. Decades later, another team, known as the Gallians, would call the city home. The Gallians were made up from the town's African American residents and played their home games at a field in Canoga. Many citizens spent their time on the banks of the river and ventured out to ice skate when the water froze. As a young boy, Arthur Harding began trapping beaver and muskrat along the water's edge. Within a few years, he started a small business selling his furs. Harding also had a strong interest in publishing, and in 1898, he formed a newspaper known as the Gallipolis Times. He soon took the knowledge he gained from the newspaper business and married it to his first love, the outdoors. In 1900, Harding published the first edition of a new magazine, Hunter, Trader, Trapper, one of the first outdoor magazines in the United States. By 1904, the publication was such a success that he sold the Gallia Times, devoted himself to his magazine, and moved production to Columbus. He became ill in 1914 and was forced to sell Hunter, Trader, Trapper. When he recovered, he returned with a new magazine known as Fur, Fish, and Game. Fur, Fish, and Game was an instant success and became the epicenter of the outdoor writing world for generations. Mr. Harding's Gallipolis Times was one of many small newspapers that flourished throughout the town. An earlier publication, known as the Gallipolis Journal, was owned and operated by Mr. Albert Stewart. Mr. Stewart published the journal during the mid-1800s. He then left his home in Gallipolis and moved to Cincinnati. There he worked as a salesman for the Strobridge Lithographic Company, selling posters for various entertainment acts of the day.
If you were a magician, if you did plays, if you did musicals, and you needed a handbill or a poster, Strobridge was who you called. And Mr. Stewart was their main salesperson.
Not content to merely advertise for others, Mr. Stewart attempted his own entertainment ventures. In 1877, he built a large aquarium on Cincinnati's Mound Hill. His plan was to exhibit living beluga whales for paying customers. Unfortunately, all 3 of Mr. Stewart's whales died within days of their arrival. After exiting the whale business, Mr. Stewart continued his work with Strobridge and maintained his close ties to the circus industry. In 1906, he negotiated the sale of Barnum & Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth to the Ringling Brothers.
He also stated that Ringling could only buy their posters and all of their playbills from Strobridge. So it made him a very wealthy man.
He built a lavish home on First Avenue in Gallipolis for his mother and 3 unwed sisters. He then bought a villa on the French Riviera for his winter home. In late 1911, Mr. Stewart sent a telegram to the Ringlings, letting them know he was coming back to America for more business.
To Mr. Charles Ringling, Baraboo, Wisconsin. Dear Sir, in a letter received from Mr. Stewart, he requests that you be advised that he will sail on the Titanic, April 10th, and is due to arrive here on April 16th. Yours very truly, Strobridge Lithographic Company.
Mr. Stewart booked a first-class stateroom on the Titanic's B deck. When the iceberg struck, Mr. Stewart made his way to the lifeboats, where he spoke with his fellow passengers.
He told them to get in one of the lifeboats and that he would be with them in just a few minutes, and nobody saw him after that.
Mr. Stewart's body was never recovered, but a centipede was erected in his memory at Mound Hill Cemetery. As the survivors of the Titanic huddled in their lifeboats, the ship Carpathia made its way for rescue. On board the Carpathia was Lillian Charrington of Gallipolis, honeymooning with her new husband. When the Carpathia arrived at the New York City docks, dozens of journalists crowded the scene. Among them were many reporters for the New York Evening Mail, sending dispatches back to their new assistant editor, O.O. McIntyre. As a youth in Gallipolis, Odd McIntyre, named for his uncle, Odd, spent his time riding an old bicycle through the city's streets.
And he learned to be quite a trickster on that bicycle. He even could ride it down the street with the handlebars under his arm. And he would do that when he knew where his childhood sweetheart, Maybelle, was.
After a brief stint with the Cincinnati Post, he and Maybelle, now married, began to look for work elsewhere.
And he and Maybelle headed for the Big Apple.
Odd worked for various publications throughout New York. Disillusioned with working for someone else, Odd began writing his own column, New York Day by Day. He wrote stories of the daily hustle and bustle of the Big Apple, and his small-town upbringing in Gallipolis allowed him to approach his subjects in a unique manner.
What he wrote really appealed to people in small towns like the one that he was from. They wanted to read what was going on in New York City. Things that people who lived in New York City just shrugged and tossed aside.
I write from a country town angle of a city's glamour, and the metropolis has never lost its thrill for me. Things the ordinary New Yorker accepts casually are my dish. The telescope man on the curb, the Bowery lodging houses, and the speakeasies. O.O. McIntyre.
The column was an immediate success, and it was soon featured in more than 500 newspapers across the United States and the globe. Odd adopted the pen name O.O. McIntyre, and while his initials were on the byline, New York Day by Day was a team effort with his assistant, Maybelle. His sudden popularity allowed Odd and Maybelle to mingle with New York's elite, and they were frequent guests and hosts of lavish parties. The McIntyre's guestbook even includes a signature and small bit of music from composer George Gershwin. In the 1930s, Odd and Maybelle purchased their dream home in Gallipolis, but before they could move, tragedy struck. On Valentine's Day, 1938, just 3 days before their 30th anniversary, Odd passed away from a heart attack.
5,000 people came to pay their respects. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent his sympathy message, and Jack Dempsey sent flowers.
After his death, Maybelle spent her summers at their dream home in Gallipolis.
She was one of the most dynamic people. People were fascinated by the fact that she had the limousine and the limousine driver and so forth. It gave a lot of class to the community.
Her black Rolls-Royce, driven by her chauffeur, Thomas Bus Lee, was a common sight on the city's streets.
And nobody had ever seen a car like that in Gallipolis. The car was petitioned off to have the glass between her and him. And he was out in the open. And he'd get in that car and drive her around on Sunday. And he'd take her to church, and she'd just take a ride around the city. It was an awe to see that car come through town with Bus Lee driving it.
As the nation found itself consumed by World War I, City Park was once again transformed. Soldiers from Gallia County staged on its soil before shipping off to Europe. After the war, in 1931, a monument was constructed to honor those who lost their lives.
John Oliver's mother had that built because he was one of the first Gallia County people that was killed in World War I. The company that he was with, they bivouacked right on that exact spot. 5 of those fellows were killed in World War I in France.
Local Dr. Charles Holzer Sr. also served in the war as a surgeon. Holzer came to Gallipolis in 1909 to work at the Ohio Hospital for Epileptics, the first epileptic hospital in the United States. He and his wife Alma recognized the pressing need for quality medical care in the city and set up a small hospital on 2nd Avenue. It soon outgrew the location, and another facility was constructed on Cedar Street. The Holzers were instrumental citizens in Gallipolis and were involved in many philanthropic ventures as well.
He brought the airport. He organized that. Things on the river like dams and things like that. He was almost, I don't want to say a god in his time, but he was really something.
In the 1920s, Dr. Holzer worked to connect the town to its sister city, Point Pleasant.
He was instrumental in working and forming a group to establish and build the famous Silver Bridge.
Plans were made for a state-of-the-art suspension bridge, and the construction was completed in 1928. A crowd of thousands attended the opening celebration. The bridge was painted in shiny aluminum paint and dubbed by the locals the Silver Bridge. The new bridge proved vital to the economic stability of the area, and hundreds of cars and trucks crossed the river on a daily basis. In 1932, Dr. Holzer and several influential citizens erected a marker in City Park to commemorate the worst floods in the town's history. The line for the 1913 flood was considered to be the highest the river could rise. Mother Nature had other plans. In January 1937, weeks of torrential rains cascaded through Ohio, and water poured through Gallipolis. Stores in the city's downtown were devastated. A few months later, construction of a roller dam just below Gallipolis was completed, taming the water's rage. 4 years later, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, many sons of Gallipolis were once again called to serve. Among them was Henry Norman.
He was our principal at the Lincoln Elementary School. He was the principal of Bidwell Porter Colored School, and then he made a career out of being in the Army.
They commissioned him second lieutenant, and he progressed through the ranks to major.
When Henry entered the service, a program was underway in Tuskegee, Alabama, training African-American soldiers to fly combat aircraft. Known as the Tuskegee Airmen, they were the first black aviators in United States military history. Henry graduated on December 7, 1943, and was assigned to the Army's 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Henry served as a liaison pilot for the division's artillery. His single-engine plane, named Limpy, was unarmed. His only defense, a pistol or small rifle. He flew low and slow over the battlefield, directing artillery fire onto enemy positions.
Henry Norman was my uncle. My fondest memories of him was when he flew a plane into what is now Walmart. It used to be an empty field. He took me up there and let me sit in the plane.
When the war ended, another young soldier returned home to his family in Gallipolis. Before he left for the service, he and his wife had owned a small restaurant in town. When he returned, they opened another. Bob Evans descended from a line of original Welsh immigrants in the early 1800s. He was raised in Gallipolis, where he married Jewel Waters. Jewel had moved to the town from the mountains of North Carolina when her father John took a job building the roller dam. After their wedding, they opened a small diner in Gallipolis. With Jewel's help in the kitchen, the restaurant was an instant success.
Can you imagine a mountain girl from North Carolina, how good the cooking would be? I mean, she was a scratch cook. So the food was great, and they were rocking and rolling, and then Dad gets called up.
When Bob was called to serve during World War II, the Evans sold the business. When he returned, they purchased a small building next to the terminal truck stop, adjacent to the Silver Bridge, and opened a new restaurant. The 12-stool diner came to be known as the Terminal Steakhouse.
It's open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The food was to die for. And he couldn't get good country sausage. So he decided he would make his own. And indeed he did. And the famous Bob Evans sausage was started there out of a need to serve the truckers good country sausage in that little 12-stool diner. And that's when he decided maybe he ought to sell it at the grocery store and try that.
Hello, folks. I'm Bob Evans. I'm so sure you'll like our Bob Evans Farm sausage that you have my personal guarantee it's the finest you've ever tasted, or I'll give your money back.
As production increased, he soon needed a larger processing facility. Lacking the funds to build it himself, he asked his father for support.
Grandpa didn't like the idea, but he went along with it. He said, I'll go in with you on it. I have one proviso that when you build the building, you put a sliding door on one end, so when you go broke, we can put tractors in there.
Instead of tractors, he bought a bread truck.
And he would go down to the ice plant in Gallipolis. We had an ice plant in those days, and buy blocks of ice and put in those bread racks, and then put lard cans full of bulk sausage on the floor of that truck and let that ice melt and drip over those lard cans and go up and down the road peddling sausage. And that's how he started. He told me he stopped once 88 times in one day. One trip, they made 88 stops.
In 1953, Bob and Jewel purchased a farm from Rio Grande College. They moved their family to the homestead and increased production.
Dad always said the greatest secret weapon that Bob Evans Farms ever had was the farm, because he said people like to buy from a farmer on the farm.
By now, Bob Evans was a household name, but it was by no means a one-man operation. Jewel played an equally important role on the farm.
She ran the farm, she ran the house, and Dad counseled with her a lot, and he told me later in life he wished he had listened more to Mother's ideas.
So many people came to visit the farm at Rio Grande that the Evans opened a small diner next to the homestead called the Sausage Shop. They soon expanded, and the first Bob Evans restaurant opened on Chillicothe's Water Street in 1962.
It was a fast food restaurant, and it didn't work. And they had a special board of directors meeting. The directors wanted to close it down and just quit. Dad said no. He said, I know how to do this. We've done this at the steakhouse. We're going to make it a family restaurant, and it'll work. And they did that. And they opened up on Monday morning to a big crowd. And, of course, now there's 568 of them. And they aren't fast food.
Over the years, Bob Evans restaurants and sausage spread throughout the country, and his farm put Gallia County and Rio Grande on the map.
And then there's basketball, for which Rio Grande is best known for because of one guy, Bevo Francis.
Now let's meet Clarence Bevo Francis. Coach Newt Oliver calls Bevo the greatest player in the game today, maybe the greatest of all time.
Clarence Bevo Francis was born in Jefferson County, Ohio in 1932. By his senior year of high school, he was 6'9". After being recruited by head coach Newt Oliver, Bevo moved to Rio Grande with his wife and young child.
Bevo told me that the first time he drove to Rio Grande, he missed it. He drove by it because he said, there are only 3 buildings. He said, I couldn't be a college, but there was.
Rio Grande in the Ohio hamlet of the same name. Population 203. College enrollment 94. Here it is, the entire student body.
When Bevo arrived, Rio Grande had only 38 male students. 11 of them played on the basketball team. Bevo's presence on the court made an immediate impact. Rio Grande went 39-0 in 1952, the most wins ever by an undefeated team.
Bevo scored 116 points in a game. Rio Grande was famous. The large newspapers started to assign guys to find out how many points Bevo scored that night.
Do you feel any pressure mounting with all of this publicity and so forth in connection with your exploits in basketball?
No, none. It's just like...
Bevo scored his record 116 points against Ashland. But since it came against a junior college, the record was taken away. Newt Oliver was furious.
And so Newt decided he was going to get that record back. And so Bevo scores 113 points in a game. You go out and you score 113 points without anybody guarding you. It puts a perspective on it. What he did was spatial.
In an effort to show that his team could compete with anyone, Oliver filled the schedule with the powerhouses of college basketball.
The quintet from tiny Rio Grande College of Ohio gets its first real test in the big time as it meets the highly regarded Wildcats of Villanova.
They took Villanova to overtime in Philadelphia and then beat Providence in Boston Garden. Then they defeated Wake Forest.
Rio Grande, for 2 years, was the basketball capital of the world. And then the wheels fell off the wagon.
In 1954, controversy engulfed Rio Grande when Bevo Francis was expelled from school. Administrators blamed his punishment on poor attendance.
It boils down to he was married with a child and needed money, so he took a couple weeks off to go work. And so he was dismissed, and Newt Oliver left that same year. The president at that time left that same year.
When he left Rio Grande, Bevo signed a contract with the Boston Whirlwinds, who competed every night against the Harlem Globetrotters. Tired of being forced to lose, Bevo left the team. He was drafted by the Philadelphia Warriors of the NBA, but instead, he took a job in a steel mill back home in Jefferson County.
Bevo is maybe the most unique character in American sport. He appeared out of nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. Later in life, his love was to listen to his dogs run rabbits, and as a young man, his love was his wife and shooting baskets.
A year after Bevo left Rio Grande, a Gallia County grandmother found herself on the side of a mountain in Maine. 5 years earlier, Emma Gatewood had been sitting in a dentist's office when she picked up a copy of National Geographic magazine. Inside was a story of adventure in America's wilderness on the newly constructed Appalachian Trail. Emma had been recently divorced from her husband, Perry Gatewood. Now single and her children grown, she recognized her chance to do something incredible. The magazine showed beautiful pictures and spoke of the leisurely stroll assured any prospective traveler. In 1954, Emma headed for the trailhead at Mount Katahdin in Maine.
She didn't get very far. They had to come and rescue her, but she told people she was not lost, she was just misplaced.
Undeterred, and perhaps slightly embarrassed, Emma began planning her next adventure. A year later, at the age of 67, she left for the trail again. This time, she began at Mount Oglethorpe in Georgia and headed north. She carried only the bare essentials.
Well, she took a shower curtain because a shower curtain can be used for several things. It can be used for a raincoat. It can be used for a ground cover. She usually didn't have but one pair of shoes, and she wore Keds. If she started wearing them out, she would stop in a town and buy a new pair.
The leisurely stroll promised by the magazine was nowhere to be found. The trail was rough and often dangerous. Bear and snakes filled the forests, but they were nothing compared to the mice.
She would lay down at night and she'd make a bed out of the leaves and put her shower curtain in her blanket, and she might wake up the next morning and there'd be mice trying to make a nest out of her hair.
Just like her first trip, Emma didn't bother to let anyone at home know of her plans.
I don't know if she would have been halfway when newspapers were getting word that she was doing this, and so she decided she better start writing her kids and telling them.
Emma soon became a celebrity and was hounded by journalists and photographers as she hiked.
She liked, I think, being a celebrity. Even though she hit this one newspaper guy with her umbrella because he was bothering her and wanted to take pictures, and she just wanted to hike. But then when they didn't stop her, she would get upset.
On September 25, 1955, Emma reached her destination, the top of Mount Katahdin, becoming the first woman to hike the entire Appalachian Trail alone.
I think she walked because Grandma knew she could do it. If you told her she couldn't do it, that was all the more reason for her to say, well, I'm going to do it. And she did. So then she did it again. And then she did the Oregon Trail. And then she walked the Appalachian again.
Throughout the rest of her life, she became an advocate for the Appalachian Trail and was instrumental in blazing the Buckeye Trail in her home state of Ohio. A few months after Emma's 80th birthday, the citizens of Gallipolis were busy making preparations for Christmas.
December 15th, 1967.
Around 5 o'clock, something like that. It was cold, and you started hearing all these sirens going up the road, and you thought, what in the world is going on? And it didn't stop.
The phone rings, and it's my dad, and he's going, Cheryl. I said, what? He goes, the bridge fell. Of course, I've got chills going down my spine right now. I couldn't imagine.
The Silver Bridge was held together by suspension, eye-bars linking the various components together. Over time, a small crack developed in eye-bar number 330. After decades of corrosion and the weight of increased traffic, it failed.
And then it was just like domino effect. The whole bridge went down.
The Silver Bridge took years to build. In approximately 1 minute, it was gone.
44 bodies were recovered. 2 of them, a woman and a baby, were never recovered. They never found them.
That evening, Bus Lee, Mrs. McIntyre's driver, was stuck in traffic atop the bridge.
He was on the bridge when it fell. My cousin Mike had just exited off the bridge when he heard it going down, and he remembered stopping because they were at dead stops and talking to my Uncle Bus, and he knew he had gone down on the bridge.
It was just like putting a great, big, gray mantle over things,
And we came back for that Christmas, and this town was dead because the bridge had fallen just before Christmas.
Recognizing the importance of travel between the two cities, President Lyndon B. Johnson immediately ordered construction of a new bridge.
When the bridge fell, they had promised they would have the bridge back up within 2 years. So exactly 2 years to the day, December the 15th, 1969, the bridge was dedicated.
Today, the Silver Memorial Bridge stands as a monument to those who perished. Over time, the spirit of Christmas returned to Gallipolis. In 2012, a group of citizens founded Gallipolisan Lights, a yearly festival of Christmas lights adorning the trees in City Park.
There were 300 individual Christmas trees decorated by individuals and businesses, and they completely lined the walkways of the park. You could hardly get through town after dark because everybody came to see it.
No Christmas celebration would be complete without Santa Claus, and Gallipolis had one of the best. When his son's kindergarten class needed a Santa for the Christmas party, Mike Polson stepped in and became a fixture of the holidays in Gallipolis for decades.
He really brought Santa Claus alive in Gallipolis.
At the 20-year mark, he had a massive heart attack, 6 bypasses. And when he got home from the hospital, the first thing he did was call Chamber and say, "I will be in the park in December." This happened in late October. So he gave himself 1 month to recover because he wanted to be there for the kids. He kept it up for 40 years. By the time he retired, he was seeing every school. Every child sat on his lap. But I know that there were people who sat on his lap when they were little that were bringing their kids to sit on his lap. In the big cities, Chicago or New York, I'm sure they find somebody who's very professional looking. But I don't think they'll ever find anybody with the same heart that Mike had. I think it makes us special.
It's special here, unlike other places. Not the big city feel. You know your neighbors and you care about them. I think a sense of community, and that's lost in an awful lot of America today. And I think we still have it here.
In a small town like this, everybody knows everybody, and that's what makes it so personal.
We're a breed of our own. We're river people, and we're tough. You had to be tough to live by the river. You know, it was just a hard place to live, but I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
I walk through the Pine Street Cemetery or Mound Hill Cemetery, and I look at all the names of the people I knew and the history, and I don't know, it's just home.
And I feel so blessed, and I thank God for it every day.
What we do not find is an individual, a man towering above all the rest, for there is no hero where all are brave. They stood together, and time has leveled down their graves to a common surface. But there are materials for a story that, by keeping close to the truth, will one day resurrect the old French city and make it the term of pilgrimages for the descendants scattered today from end to end of America, like leaves that are blown by the blasts of October. Lawrence J. Kenny.
First of all, let's get one thing out of the way.
What's that?
How do you pronounce this town's name?
Gallipolis.
Gallipolis.
Gallipolis. Well, you can pronounce it Gallipolis, or you can call it Gallipolis.
I say Gallipolis.
Gallipolis.
And I usually say Gallipolis, but I'm not a native.
I've got that good old colloquial accent going, and so you hear 2 syllables when I say it. But the History Society would not like me for that.
I'm originally from West Virginia. And so a lot of times I pronounce it wrong and I get corrected.
Please don't hiss. It's not Gallipolis. So.
Because it's been called everything, as you well know, from Gallipolis to Gallipoli and so forth.
The most fun was the drive-in theater. If you came down here to Canoga, and you remember when they sent the advertisements out, and it came back Gallipolis, or it was, you name it, they pronounced it wrong. We would sit and wait for the commercials.
I just say it how I say it and then hope nobody corrects me.
Funding for Our Town Gallipolis is provided by Ohio Valley Bank and its Community First mission. Established in 1872, Ohio Valley Bank has 16 locations throughout Ohio and West Virginia. More information at ovbc.com. And from Holzer Health System, providing care throughout southeastern Ohio and western West Virginia. In the words of Dr. Charles E. Holzer, Jr., the patient is the center of all we do. Additional support provided by the Gallia County Chamber of Commerce, working for business, supporting the community, and investing in Gallia County. The University of Rio Grande and Rio Grande Community College, providing an oasis of learning, innovation, and technology in the region. Rio Grande, personal, powerful, proud. Willis Funeral Home, family-owned and operated since 1974. At Willis, our aim is to be worthy of your friendship. The Gallia County Convention and Visitors Bureau, providing a source for regional and community events and information about beautiful, historic Gallipolis and Gallia County. The Wiseman Insurance Agency of Gallipolis, a fourth-generation family business serving Ohio and the surrounding area since 1928. And by the Farmers Bank and Saving Company, member FDIC.